So, elemental damage, hard, fast, and aggressive. Let's go! Right, I've done a ton of testing with elemental damage simply just because on the official First Descendant Discord I posted my Thundercage build and a lot of people were confused as to why I wasn't using an elemental damage type thing, toxic, fire, lightning, or chill, cold, freezy. And the simple reason is unless you know specifically what the enemy is actually directly weak to, elemental damage is doing nowhere near what you actually think it's doing. It's not like it's particularly bad, it's just I don't want to change mods in my weapon every time a new enemy decides to look at me. That's quite simply it. There are also better and easier ways to get more damage than relying on an element. I'm not saying element is bad, again, it can be pretty good under the right circumstances, as well as on some weapons that don't really conform to utilizing crit or weak point, you kind of have to go down the elemental route. Now, for my lovely little test, I'm going to be running the Last Dagger. I'm just going to add two mods. We're going to add in some more firearm attack of rifle reinforcement and then a toxic attack. The weapon itself has no element on it. It's got a little bit of weak point, etc, etc. However, that's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is the fact that element damage is not affected by weak point at all. You can go to the range, the laboratory, what you want to call it, and test this. Get a weapon with element damage, shoot them in the head. Your bullet damage will get the nice orange number to signify a weak point, but your element damage won't actually get, well, it doesn't actually change color at all. But you might also notice that there's no significant difference between not hitting a weak point as well as hitting a weak point. That being said, your element damage can crit, and the crit seems to work independently of the bullet damage, which means your bullet can crit but the element might not, or the element might crit but the bullet might not. So it is kind of in a weird way good in that scenario. Now all I'm doing here is going through the different factions just to show that depending on the faction, Legion of Immortality, Order of Truth, Legion of Darkness, you will get different results. For the Legion of Immortality, I get 6,195 bullet damage and I get 2,231 toxic damage. This is a 36.01% essentially multiplier on our damage. It isn't the 30% as advertised. The reason for this is Legion of Immortality are directly weak to toxic. So being weak to toxic essentially gives us a 6% buff. That's great. However, we're now shooting the Order of Truth, a faction known for throwing poison around, but they also have quite low defense. Our bullet damage here, without changing any of our mods, is 14,422. Like, this is a huge increase in bullet damage. But we've also gone down to 1,744 toxic damage, which now means that 30% toxic damage we have is only doing 12.09%. And then the final faction, Legion of Darkness, we're getting 6,131 bullet damage, but we're also only getting 1,884. This is kind of in line. It's 30.71. You can see here the faction, Legion of Immortality, bullet damage, toxic, Order of Truth, bullet damage, toxic, and then Legion of Damned, bullet damage, toxic. Hopefully as well, you should be seeing in the background that the element itself can also crit. So, element on a weak point build, perhaps not the best thing to do. Element on a crit build can actually be quite worthwhile. However, what this is absolutely showing is that your element itself is going to be, one, reduced by the enemy's actual defense, because it's not whatever your base damage would be, 30%, that's how much toxic you do. It is literally what damage number you get hitting the enemy that will directly affect the amount of toxic or element they have, and then the element resistance they have comes into play. For the next bit, this is potentially going to look a little bit weird, but this is a burst DPS calculation of the previous Thundercage build that I put up, minus lethal finish. All I've done, I've either left it empty or I have modded in a element attack. The top one has the element attack. Hopefully you can see element 30, and then obviously in the bottom one, element 0. The difference between burst and DPS is going to be huge. However, if there is a discrepancy between the two builds, the discrepancy would be the same between both burst and sustained. So if one is doing 10% more in burst, it will also be doing 10% more in sustained, simply just because our crit stats, our rolls, everything else is the same. All sustained is doing is taking into account the reload as well as the firing time. This is what 30% toxic damage is giving us. 10.57% increase in DPS. That's it. That is it. Now, once you start getting to like really big numbers, you're happy for a 1% increase. But at this level, for a 10.5% increase, that's really weak, dude. Really weak. Just to show how weak it is, same thing again, but rather on that second build, leaving the mod slot empty, I've put in precision sharp shot or something like that. Basically, the more you fire, the more damage you do, the more your fire rate goes up. Yeah, that element is now lacking behind by 11%. 11%. And it's going to work the same on every enemy, not the ones that are just weak to whatever element it is you're running. So what does any of this mean? Well, it quite simply means that unless you know that particular enemy is weak to that particular element you're using, element is nowhere near as strong as people are claiming. It also means that, see this guy, Hard Executioner, where it says attribute resistance, the lightning bolt, electric, very strong. If you're playing Bunny here, it means you're the asshole. Same with Dead Pride. Shock Horror Gasp, the big ice wench, is strong against ice but weak to fire. Like at this point, we're just playing Pokemon. Devourer, the big poison dude, is strong against poison, but oh look, he's actually weak to electric. Like this really isn't hard, guys. Pyromaniac, very strong to fire but weak to ice. Who would have thunk it? There is, however, one exception, and it's a weapon called Python. Why is Python the exception? Because the more weak point hits you get, the weaker they become to toxic, which is interesting, shall we say. Now, I'm going to put this on order of truth just because they're resistant to toxic, and on a previous weapon where we had actual more bullet damage, you'll hopefully see that we actually end up with essentially more damage. You'll also hopefully see that there's no difference between the toxic modifier and where you would normally hit with toxic, so it's absolutely not affected by weak point. Now, our base damage starts off at about 4,200 with toxic, but the more weak point hits we get, it goes up by quite a bit. And then, utilizing other set things within the build, as well as the full buff of something like Glay, we can get that toxic to go from like 4,200 to over 6,000. Which I personally find quite funny because I see a lot of people claiming that toxic is the best element when it only is if you're using Python. Only if you're using Python. Now here comes the problem. There are builds and weapons that work best with crit. There are builds and weapons that work best with weak point. There are builds and weapons that don't really fit into either of these. Cough, tamer, cough. 10% crit chance, 1.6% critical hit damage, and we got a 1 times X on our weak point damage. So we can't build it for crit. Like the highest you're going to get is like 13.6. For critical hit damage, it's what, like maybe just over 2x. And for weak point damage, you're going to get what, like 1.55. Oh wow, yeah. If I see one more person claim Tamer as the best weapon in the game, I'm going to lose my mind, dude. This is the Python build I'm running. I'm still missing a mod, and one of the mods I do have on is only half upgraded. 1.8 million sustained DPS. Tamer can suck it vigorously. So yeah, element damage is nowhere near as strong as a lot of people think it is. If you do want to go for element damage, make sure that enemy is weak to it. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. And there are a plethora of ways to outperform element damage. The only weapon that realistically gets away with it is just Python, just because of how Python works, and that's just with toxic. Everything else, it's a nice to have. Like if you've put everything else you want on that weapon and you've still got a mod slot free, go for it. But ideally I don't recommend building around a specific element. It's mostly not going to be worthwhile, especially because against one enemy, that build's going to do fine. Against the next enemy, or Colossus or a different faction, yeah, you're not going to be doing so good, potentially. It all depends on the overall raw stats. Something against, like, the Order of Truth, they actually have lower defense, so you do a ton of bullet damage against them, but you do, like, very little for, like, toxic damage, for example. But then other factions, you do less bullet damage, but your toxic is going to go up. There's way too many variables for you as an active player running around like a lunatic to actively take into account as to what element is going to be best as and when. Ideal solution, don't do it. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.